It sort of rehashed old revelations with a new twist. As it turns out, we've apparently been wrong all along. Britain is a nasty, racist hellhole where only magnificent Meghan stood up to all this, and the world's biggest victim.
The moment those photos surfaced, something strange happened. Prince Harry disappeared, not figuratively. Literally, no sightings, no public appearances, no carefully staged pap walks in Montecito, just silence. And according to insiders, that silence wasn't accidental, it was panic. Because when Piers Morgan allegedly leaked explosive yacht photos tied to Meghan, the fallout wasn't just media outrage, it was internal collapse. Sources claim phones were blowing up, emergency calls were made, and behind the gates of Montecito, damage control went into overdrive. But while Meghan's camp scrambled to contain the narrative, Harry was nowhere to be found. That's when the questions turned dangerous. Why did he leave town right as the images began circulating? Why did scheduled appearances quietly vanish from calendars? And why did insiders suddenly start whispering that Harry needed space, not from the press, but from the situation itself? The photos weren't just embarrassing, allegedly. They reopened chapters the couple had fought desperately to keep buried. Timelines didn't sit right, old narratives cracked. And Piers Morgan, long positioned as their most relentless critic, appeared to have timed the leak with surgical precision. Not to shock the public, but to expose pressure fractures inside the marriage. Social media erupted instantly. Fans split. Critics pounced. Royal watchers noticed something chilling. Meghan went silent and Harry went missing. No joint response, no united front, no hand-holding rebuttal, just distance. And once people started asking where is Harry, a darker question followed right behind it. What did he see that made him walk away when the story broke? Because in royal scandals, absence isn't just absence. It's a message. The disappearance didn't happen slowly. It was immediate, abrupt, and so perfectly timed that even long-time royal watchers felt a chill. One day, Prince Harry was the familiar Montecito figure. Occasional sightings, quiet charity chatter, background presence meant to signal stability. The next day, he was gone. No camera caught him leaving. No statement explained it. Just an eerie vacuum that opened up the exact moment Piers Morgan allegedly dropped what he'd been hinting at for years: the resurfaced yacht photos tied to Meghan's pre-royal past. According to insiders, the leak hit like a controlled detonation. Not loud at first, not chaotic, just precise. The kind of revelation that doesn't need exaggeration because the implications do all the work. The photos themselves weren't new to certain circles, allegedly. Media veterans, royal aides, and long-memory tabloid editors had seen versions, heard whispers, filed them away. What made this moment different was timing. Piers didn't release them randomly. He released them when the Sussex narrative was already under strain, when sympathy had thinned and scrutiny was sharp. Within hours, Montecito reportedly went into lockdown mode. Calls were made to legal teams, advisors scrambled to assess exposure. Not just public embarrassment, but narrative damage, because the photos didn't just show Meghan on a yacht. They allegedly reopened questions about timelines, associations, and the carefully curated story of reinvention that had been sold since her royal exit. And for Harry, those questions hit somewhere deeper than headlines. Sources close to the couple claimed Harry was blindsided, not by the existence of the photos, but by the speed at which they spread and the tone of the coverage. This wasn't playful tabloid snark. This was sharp, cold analysis. Old interviews replayed with new captions, past statements re-examined. The word inconsistency started appearing everywhere. And while Meghan's camp reportedly prepared to counter, Harry did something no one expected. He left. Where he went became its own mystery. Some claimed he flew overseas. Others said he retreated to a private residence far from California. A few whispered that he stayed with friends who weren't part of the Montecito bubble. What everyone agreed on was this: he wasn't there. And that absence spoke louder than any denial ever could. Royal insiders suggested the photos triggered something raw. That Harry, already carrying years of resentment, isolation, and identity confusion after cutting ties with the royal family, suddenly found himself facing a narrative he couldn't control. The idea that his wife's past was being reframed publicly, without filters, without palace-style containment, reportedly shook him. Because for the first time, there was no institution to absorb the blast. It was just them. Piers Morgan, meanwhile, didn't gloat. That's what unnerved people. He framed the leak as a matter of transparency, not scandal. He questioned why certain histories were labeled empowering while others were deemed off-limits. He implied hypocrisy without spelling it out. And that restraint made the impact sharper. Viewers didn't feel told what to think, they felt invited to notice. Social media went into forensic mode, screenshots circulated, angles analyzed, dates debated. Fans rushed to defend Meghan, arguing misogyny, privacy, and outdated shaming. Critics pushed back hard, insisting the issue wasn't the photos themselves but the years of narrative control surrounding them. And through it all, the same question kept resurfacing: why hasn't Harry said anything? The lack of a united response became impossible to ignore. No joint statement, no coordinated appearance, no carefully worded dismissal. Meghan's side reportedly floated the idea of ignoring it entirely, letting the news cycle burn itself out. But Harry's silence felt different, not strategic, personal, almost wounded. Some insiders claimed the photos reopened private conversations the couple thought were settled. That Harry believed he understood Meghan's past, but not the way it would be framed once hostile media took control. The difference between knowing something privately and watching it weaponized publicly can be devastating. And for someone already estranged from family, country, and identity, that pressure can feel unbearable. Royal commentators began drawing comparisons to past scandals, noting how previous royals closed ranks when under fire. Harry, by contrast, vanished. That contrast fueled speculation that this wasn't about media optics, but emotional survival. That stepping away was less about strategy and more about avoiding a breaking point. As the days passed, the silence stretched. Montecito neighbors noticed the lack of movement, no familiar routines, no security convoys. No signs of normalcy. The house felt hollow. And the longer Harry stayed gone, the more the narrative shifted from leaked photos to marital fracture. Was this temporary distance, a cooling-off period, or the first visible crack in a partnership built on defiance and mutual protection? Insiders wouldn't say, but one thing was clear: the photos didn't just expose Meghan's past, they exposed how fragile the present had become. And as the world waited for Harry to reappear, another question crept in, darker and harder to dismiss. If a few old images could make a prince disappear, what else was he running from? As the silence dragged on, the story evolved from curiosity into something far more unsettling. Prince Harry's absence stopped being treated as coincidence and started being read as a response. Not to the public, not to Piers Morgan, but to whatever detonated privately the moment those yacht photos hit the world. And insiders say the fallout inside Montecito was far uglier than anything playing out online. According to sources familiar with the situation, the leak triggered emergency conversations that went far beyond public relations. This wasn't about whether the photos were appropriate, outdated, or unfairly weaponized. It was about controls, specifically who had it, who lost it, and who realized too late that they never really did. Harry, who had already sacrificed his royal role, family ties, and home country in the name of protecting Meghan, was suddenly faced with a narrative he couldn't shield her from. Behind closed doors, advisors allegedly clashed. One camp pushed for aggressive counterattacks, accused Piers of obsession, framed the photos as misogynistic relics, flood the media with distractions. Another camp warned that pushing back would only amplify the images and invite deeper scrutiny into timelines that were better left untouched. The disagreement reportedly created tension not just among staff, but between Harry and Meghan themselves. Sources claim Harry felt blindsided by the scale of the response. He expected criticism, he'd lived with it for years. What he didn't expect was the tone. The questions weren't about morality, they were about credibility. About whether the Sussex brand had been built on selective transparency. About why certain aspects of Meghan's past were celebrated when useful and erased when inconvenient. That framing reportedly cut deep. And then there was Piers Morgan's role. Insiders say Harry took the leak personally, not because of the photos themselves, but because of who released them. Piers wasn't a faceless tabloid editor. He was a familiar antagonist, someone Harry believed symbolized the very media cruelty he'd spent years condemning. The idea that Piers still had the power to shake his life, years after leaving the royal fold, allegedly sent Harry spiraling. Royal watchers noticed something else during this period. Meghan's voice went quiet too, but in a different way. No emotional appeals, no impassioned defenses, just carefully measured silence. Some interpreted that as confidence. Others saw calculation. Insiders whispered that the couple disagreed on how to handle it, with Meghan favoring containment and Harry craving resolution or escape. That's when reports surfaced that Harry had needed space. The phrase appeared suddenly, almost casually, in media coverage. But people close to the situation said it wasn't a euphemism, it was literal. Harry allegedly felt suffocated, trapped between defending his wife and confronting the reality that he had no leverage left, no palace buffer, no institutional firewall, just public opinion and a past he couldn't rewrite. Meanwhile, the internet kept digging. Amateur investigators resurfaced old interviews, comparing Meghan's previous statements about her life before royalty with the visual evidence now circulating. Discrepancies were exaggerated, context was debated, every inconsistency, real or perceived, became ammunition. The narrative hardened. This wasn't about shame, it was about honesty, and Harry's absence only fueled it. Critics argued that if the photos were meaningless, he'd stand beside Meghan without hesitation. Supporters countered that he was protecting his mental health, but even among allies, unease grew. Because vanishing at a moment like this didn't look like strength, it looked like fracture. Sources claim Harry's disappearance wasn't meant to be permanent, but it also wasn't rushed. He reportedly turned off his phone for stretches, relying on a small circle of trusted contacts. No advisors, no handlers, just people who knew him before the titles, before the war with the press, before the identity shift. That detail alone set off alarm bells. It suggested someone trying to remember who they were before everything changed. Back in Montecito, the pressure intensified. Meghan's team allegedly worked overtime to stabilize the narrative, but without Harry's presence, the usual image of unity couldn't be maintained. Public appearances were postponed. Joint projects went quiet. The absence became a character in the story, looming, unanswered, impossible to ignore. Royal commentators began floating a theory that made supporters uncomfortable. That the photos weren't the cause of Harry's disappearance, but the catalyst. That they reopened unresolved doubts, unspoken fears, and questions Harry had buried in the rush to protect, defend, and rebuild. The idea that he had given up everything for a story that was now being picked apart publicly may have been too much to process under the spotlight. As days turned into a week, the narrative sharpened into something stark. Either Harry would return and stand firm, or his continued absence would confirm what critics already suspected, that the Sussex partnership was under more strain than anyone wanted to admit. The photos were no longer the headline. Harry's disappearance was, and hovering over it all was the most dangerous question yet. If Prince Harry could vanish this completely, this suddenly, at the first uncontrollable rupture in the narrative, what would happen when the next revelation hit? By the time the third phase unfolded, the conversation had shifted from scandal to something far more destabilizing: identity. Prince Harry's disappearance was no longer being framed as a tactical retreat or a temporary mental health break. It was being interpreted as a man confronting the consequences of a life rebuilt on narratives that suddenly felt fragile. And that shift made everything more volatile. Royal insiders began quietly suggesting that Harry's absence wasn't about the yacht photos themselves, but about what they represented. The images weren't shocking in isolation. What shook him, according to those close to the situation, was how easily they were used to dismantle years of carefully constructed storytelling. The idea that one leak could reframe his marriage, his sacrifices, and his public crusade against the media reportedly forced Harry to confront a truth he'd avoided. Control was an illusion. Behind the scenes, sources claimed conversations turned brutally honest. Not fights, not accusations, but moments where silence did more damage than shouting ever could. Harry allegedly questioned how many times the past had been selectively explained to him versus fully understood. Not out of suspicion alone, but out of exhaustion. When your entire adult life becomes a defense strategy, even love can start to feel like labor. Meghan, meanwhile, was said to be operating in survival mode, not emotional collapse, but calculated endurance. Insiders described her as composed, strategic, and deeply aware that any misstep would be amplified. That composure, however, reportedly created distance. Where Harry needed reassurance and grounding, Meghan focused on containment and optics. The mismatch in emotional needs widened an already dangerous gap. The obsession narrative re-emerged here in a new form. Critics accused Meghan of being obsessed with narrative control, unwilling to allow vulnerability if it meant losing leverage. Supporters fired back that Harry's retreat proved he couldn't handle pressure without institutional protection. The truth, as usual, likely sat somewhere in between, but nuance doesn't survive viral cycles. What did survive was the symbolism of absence. Harry missing from Montecito became shorthand for instability. Paparazzi camped outside, commentators speculated nightly. Every day he didn't return hardened the assumption that something had broken beyond repair. And when you let assumptions calcify long enough, they become public truth regardless of reality. Then came the quiet confirmations. Not statements, but shifts in behavior that spoke volumes. Harry was reportedly spotted far from California, moving without security theater, dressed down, blending in. People who encountered him described someone lighter but withdrawn, not panicked, reflective. That detail mattered. It suggested someone stepping out of a role rather than fleeing a crisis. At the same time, Meghan's public posture sharpened. She leaned into independence narratives again, emphasizing self-definition and resilience. To supporters, it read as strength. To skeptics, it felt like preemptive distancing. The idea that each was preparing for different outcomes became harder to ignore. Royal historians began drawing uncomfortable parallels, not to past scandals, but to moments when royals stepped away from public life because the story no longer matched the self. Harry, stripped of titles and duties by choice, now faced a second stripping of certainty. And without the palace machine to guide him, he had to decide what came next on his own terms. Piers Morgan notably faded from the center of the conversation. His role as catalyst was acknowledged, but the story had outgrown him. This was no longer about media cruelty or tabloid ethics. It was about what happens when a couple builds their identity in opposition to an institution and then loses control of their own narrative. The enemy was no longer external, it was exposure. As weeks passed, the possibility that Harry's disappearance marked a permanent shift began to feel real. Not necessarily separation, but redefinition. Insiders suggested that if he returned, it would be on altered terms, fewer appearances, less performative unity, more guarded autonomy. And if he didn't, the absence would be interpreted as the loudest statement he'd ever made. Public sympathy fractured. Some saw a man reclaiming himself after years of sacrifice. Others saw abandonment at the worst possible moment. Meghan, caught in that split, faced intensified scrutiny. Every move was read as confirmation of one theory or another. The grace period she once enjoyed evaporated. The most unsettling realization for observers was this. The photos didn't destroy anything. They revealed stress fractures that were already there. Harry's disappearance didn't create doubt, it exposed it. And once exposed, doubt has a way of rewriting everything that came before it. By the end of this phase, the story no longer needed new leaks. The silence itself had become evidence. Montecito, once marketed as a sanctuary from royal chaos, now felt like a pressure cooker that finally vented. Harry's vanishing act wasn't a mystery anymore, it was a response. Whether he returns publicly or not, one thing is certain. The illusion of control is gone, and in its place stands a prince forced to decide whether the life he chose still fits, now that the story protecting it has cracked wide open. If you're still watching right now, understand this, you're witnessing a moment that doesn't happen often. This isn't just another royal headline that fades in a week. This is a crack in the story that was supposed to last forever. And once cracks show, everything people swore was unbreakable starts coming apart fast. This situation is still unfolding. Silence is still speaking. Absence is still answering questions no statement ever could. And the next move, whether Harry reappears, whether Meghan speaks, whether another leak surfaces, will change how this story is remembered permanently. Miss it, and you'll only get the rewritten version later. So don't scroll past this like it's old news. Hit like to push this into the conversation where it belongs. Subscribe so you're here the moment the next development drops without warning. And comment, because public memory is shaped by who pays attention in real time, not by who shows up after the dust settles. This isn't about sides, it's about seeing the story before it's sanitized. Stay locked in, because once the truth finishes surfacing, there's no undoing what everyone is about to realize.